Hello everybody, hopefully this all works. It's been a while since I've done this format. This is of course the format where I record myself watching something, I pause and then I react and then I edit it down. I used to really like this format. I used to think it was really fun. So I thought I would revive it, but since it's a bit easier, I thought, well, it's kind of a good thing to do as a little extra bonus thing for Patreon. The one slight difference is that I now have my camera off to the side. I don't know how weird that will look if I'm looking. There we go. I can't see. I don't know. How does this look? Does it, is it too much side profile? We'll see. We'll workshop it. Speaking of workshopping it, of course, in theory, I'm 2 weeks behind on this. I mentioned first doing this 2 weeks ago, and then I missed one because we thought we were going to fly to the UK. And then I missed the next one because we actually did fly to the UK. I know that I just said this is easy and therefore that shouldn't have been an issue, but it was always where we were staying. It was a bit awkward to film. It was a bit of an annoyance to film because Americans, they love their air conditioning, specifically with the vents. So I don't know how anyone does YouTube in America, right? Because they've got vents everywhere, so you'll just be doing whatever, chilling. So yeah, it was already frustrating enough to film what I did film there. So, whatever. I'm not going to catch up on those 2 weeks, which is fine because it was kind of arbitrary when I started anyway. But now that I have started, I am actually going to stick with it. So basically, going forward, I haven't quite worked out the exact time. Essentially, there's going to be two things I do. One will be each week make a post. Well, three things. One will be each week make a post saying, hey guys, what videos would you be interested in me reviewing? The next thing I'll do is put about 4 of the topics up to a vote. If there's fewer than or as many as 4, then it will just be those. If there's more than 4 suggestions, which hopefully as things kind of pick up steam, that will be the case, I will use a randomizer, basically, like a randomness generator to basically select it. The one thing I will remove is anything which I think is interesting enough that it would be better, I think, for a video for the main channel. That's not to say, I think we'll have a lot of fun making these videos. I think I'll have a lot of fun making these videos and hopefully, you guys will enjoy them. But it's just not the kind of stuff you'll see as we go through and into the future, many weeks into the future, that these are not the kind of videos, good videos from the perspective of the YouTube algorithm. That's, I guess, what I'm talking about, really. That's the distilled version, the YouTube algorithm. So somebody recommended Jessie Gender's Trans Women Are Not Biological Males. That, for example, is a video that I will obviously do on my main channel because that sounds like a good video for my main channel. So there we go. This video is called Paddling in the Shallow End, Media Misogyny in the Terfosphere, and it is by a channel called Freda Media or Freda Media. This channel has just over 1,000 subscribers, not a very large channel. Somebody wanted me to respond to it, so let's see. And of course, start thinking about what other things you can imagine I might want to respond to. Again, I would say, generally speaking, if there's a video that you would like me to respond to, you should recommend it, because either I will genuinely consider responding to it in this format, or I will actually respond to it on my main channel. So either way, I'll probably make a response to it at some point.
This story about
Look, so in this, I'm actually tempted to... I'm going to turn up to a 1.25 because this person talks very slowly. I hope that's not a problem. I do know that I have, people who like to then watch my videos at 2 times speed. By the way, I have no idea what, because I'm obviously going to upload this directly to Patreon and Subscribestar. I don't know what the media player things are like that. I hope you have the option of turning it up to 2 times speed. If not, there are various extensions that allow you to basically speed up any video to 2 times speed. But yeah, I'm aware that people like to watch my stuff at 2 times speed because I don't talk massively quickly. And even people who do talk quickly, like I personally like to listen to stuff slightly faster. So I don't like to, when I'm watching a video, I don't like to turn it up too much myself, because I'm aware that then from the perspective of the people who are watching it at, 2x speed, it will be a disaster. However, in this case, I think I can get away with it because this person's talking very slowly.
Let's just get one thing straight. The people campaigning for this don't give a shit about women's safety. They don't actually have any other interest in supporting the lives of vulnerable women or any work against misogyny in society.
This is what they say all the time, but it's just not true. I don't know where this idea. Well, I do know where it comes from. It comes from lies. But the problem is, again, and this is one of those examples where I say I can't imagine anyone could possibly be an ex-gender critical person, because as soon as you understand the gender critical movement, you have to understand that, yeah, okay, there are some people who maybe don't have completely credible feminist credentials. There are people who wouldn't even claim to be feminists. There are a lot of people, undeniably, who do care about it. Even if you're not going to say it's everyone, even if you're not going to say it's the majority of people, you've got to say it's a decent number. And the problem is that this argument, it's not just a random thing they're saying. Trans activists have to say this because it's the only way they can possibly argue that the gender critical movement doesn't have credibility as kind of being associated with the progressive left. It's the only way they can argue, oh, this is just a conservative, nonsense, bigoted idea that's destined to eventually fail because, the march of social progress. But of course, they're lying. And you guys know they're lying. It does occur to me now that obviously, now that I'm making these videos just for Patreon, chances are I'm not going to be appealing to anyone who is on the trans activist side. So I guess I can save some time with some of the arguments because you guys know it. But yeah, I like to imagine that you enjoy watching my content because you enjoy hearing me make these points. So I will pretty much continue to make them. But yeah, I don't really need to stress them too much because, again, you guys already know that, of course, no, there are people who sincerely care about women's rights and women's safety. And even if people don't call themselves feminists or would even say well, I don't really agree with feminism, whatever, which I think there probably are some people in my audience who might have that opinion, because there are people in the wider gender critical movement who have that opinion. Even still, most people would support women's safety, would still support, women not having to deal with biological males in their spaces.
The adult human female version of feminism, which involves going trans women around, I don't care.
The version of feminism where you actually have a definition for the word woman, also known as the only kind of feminism that makes any sort of coherent sense.
Little old me, if I wanted to go swimming, she thinks that's going to sort of somehow pollute the environment. that's the message, anyway.
Of course, you often do have women-only classes, things like that. And there are reasons for that. Recently, my sister, she's been going to the gym, and she was saying that she was just uncomfortable at Pilates. She's, was doing Pilates at the gym, and there were men there, and, there were men who would try to talk to her, and that kind of made her uncomfortable. Well, okay. That seems like a legitimate reason to say, if you're a woman, maybe you actually want a woman-only Pilates class. Well, if you're going to have a woman-only Pilates class, you need to have a definition for the term woman, and there's no way that definition can make sense if it includes biological males. So even absent the question of, is any given specific biological male a threat? Am I saying this specific person is a threat? Maybe not, but if you're going to generally safeguard against the broader kind of threat, or at least, potential for a threat that makes women uncomfortable, you need to have a definition for what it means to be a woman. And that just can't include biological males while making sense. It's that simple.
Women swimmers, first lie. Okay, these aren't women swimmers. These are women from a trans exclusionary organisation that have descended on a pond, and they've isolated that as an excuse and a mechanism through which they can exclude trans women.
Oh wait, so is this actually a pond? So this is about wild swimming? That's something. But by the way, not a lie to say women swimmers. Again, this reminds me of something that oh God, I can't think where this was. It was maybe Katie Montgomery, or was it? It was Sean, wasn't it? It was Sean. Sean said basically about Kelly J. Keane She doesn't mean men, she means trans people. And then I was able to just show a specific example of Kelly J. Keane saying, hey, you know, I specifically mean men, not trans people. If a trans-identified female, which is to say somebody that, of course, you know, a gender-critical person would consider to be a woman, wants to join in, that's fine, because I would consider them a woman. So there we go. That's an example of where they are trans because they identify as a man, but from the perspective of a gender-critical person, they're not actually a man, they're a woman, and therefore it's not actually about excluding trans people, it's about excluding men. Kind of a similar situation here where it's like, if you're going to say they're not women, they're trans exclusionary, well, would I be allowed to join? No, obviously not, because the point is it's women only. And also, of course, it's not as if they're excluding trans affirming women. You can be a woman who believes in, you know, trans identity nonsense and still join. So these people will say things like, oh, it's not about being a woman. It's not about being a man. It's about trans identity. It's about, anti-trans bigotry, blah, blah, blah. But that's manifestly not true. If it was about like being anti-trans, then, you know, I'm sure somebody like me would be considered anti-trans, even though I wouldn't obviously describe myself that way exactly. But I wouldn't be able to join. Meanwhile, plenty of women who are themselves pro-trans or trans-affirming would be allowed to join. So it is about women swimming. It's just that simple.
I live near there, but I'm not interested. I couldn't give a toss, is what she's saying, basically. She's interested in the trans-exclusionary narrative, though.
Okay, yeah. So, again, this is like a completely valid thing. You're allowed to care about stuff that doesn't affect you directly, obviously.
Freezing cold. However, there was a vote at Kenwood Ladies.
And by the way, so it seems like this is wild swimming, which is something that my mum does, by the way. And I think you have to be, love to my mum, but you have to be a complete lunatic to do that. Like swimming in England as well. And also England, you can just about swim in a, let's say, non-temperature controlled environment if you're kind of on the west coast, because you get the Mexican Gulf, the Gulf Stream coming in. So I've been, because I live more towards the east, southeast represent. So for me, often if I'm going to the sea, I'm either going south to the Channel, which is not great, or east to the North Sea, which is a horrible, horrible place. Just the most freezing cold ever. And, you put a foot in it, you instantly turn blue. But on the west coast, where you've got the Gulf Stream coming in, you can be pleasantly surprised by how nice it is. But I say all of that. Rivers are a different beast entirely, or like ponds and things like that. You just think, like, that's got to be cold. Like you don't even, like, you're not even getting the benefit of like currents from a warmer place there. It's just pure English freezing cold, concentrated misery. I don't understand why people do wild swimming, but I don't know. People take cold showers. That's the thing people do, and apparently it's good. I don't know.
Venice Island is very close to, you might know her as Posey Parker, Kelly J. Keane, the neo-Nazi adjacent transphobe. I don't think
neo-Nazi adjacent. Incredibly poor faith framing there.
It's any controversial statement to make.
It makes no sense. Okay, at the end of the day, and I can say this now because I can't, because you pay to be part of the channel, so I don't want to rock the boat too much, because I'm sure a lot of you like Kelly J. Keane. I think there are 100% legitimate. I've always said this, to be honest. Like, I'm saying this as if it's not something I've said before. I've always thought there are legitimate criticisms that can be made of Keane, but there is a massive, massive difference between, there are some legitimate, like, you cannot like with whom Keane associates. You cannot like some of the views that Keane herself has expressed, but she's not a neo-Nazi adjacent. Essentially what you're taking there is the fact that some neo-Nazis have come to some of her rallies, because at the end of the day, like, I don't think anyone's denying that neo-Nazis are radically conservative, and radical conservatives aren't going to like the idea of men dressing up as women. Radical conservatives aren't going to like the idea of this LGBTQIA plus being, presented to children in school and things like that. Nobody's denying that there is an overlap, but does that overlap at all justify calling any gender critical person like what neo-Nazi aligned or neo-Nazi adjacent? That's ridiculous. And by the way, if you check out Rubble of Empire's video called like Who Framed Kelly J. Keane, he goes into detail. I've mentioned this before, detail about how basically the Nazis were very explicit in saying that they weren't fans of Keane, that Keane wasn't their ally. And of course, unsurprisingly, they actually showed up to the rally and then just left completely independent. Like they weren't there at the rally. It's kind of funny because the term adjacent is obviously being used here to besmirch Keane, but the term adjacent actually gets at the reality of what happened, which is to say they weren't there for the rally. They weren't there because they meaningfully supported any of the stuff the rally was really about. They were just adjacent to it. They were just next to it. They were just there at the same time. At some point, I want to call into Katie Montgomery's show, but it's just, as you know, I get kind of nervous about that direct thing. Even when I've thought about calling into, I see Katie Montgomery make these tweets like, I'm about to go live, call in. I think about it and I'm already like, just confrontation. But one of the things I would love to ask is, can you formulate an argument that starts with the premise Nazis overlap with the gender critical point of view on the point specifically of biological males can't be women? I'll grant you that premise. Can you formulate an argument that starts with that premise and gets you to, therefore, the gender critical movement is incorrect? Because, of course, the reality is you can't. Neo-Nazis also think that 2 + 2 = 4. But you can't start with the premise neo-Nazis think 2 + 2 = 4 and get to the conclusion, therefore, it's wrong to think 2 + 2 = 4. Like, that's the thing. And that's why they say it, because it's good to associate. Essentially, a lot of trans ideology arguments are basically vibes. It's just vibes-based reasoning. And therefore, to associate the negative vibes of being a neo-Nazi with the gender critical movement and, kind of pollute the vibes in that way is something that trans ideologues would like to do. But you'll notice vibes aren't actually an argument. And when you say, okay, now actually turn this into a coherent argument, you're not going to get anything.
Transphobes attack things like this. They're actually attacking your humanity, because it's like saying you're not allowed this experience. And if you want this experience, you have to deny your transgender identity to have it.
So I will point out, in this specific case, you don't have to, because, with, for example, sports, there's only the man's league and the women's league. With swimming and lots of other kind of similar things, if there is a women's only class, that doesn't mean that your only other option is to do the man only class. You just can't go to the class that's specifically for women, because if there's one time when, having a clear definition of woman matters, and a clear definition cannot include biological males, then it's going to be when there is a class where they've said, this is specifically for women. And you just can't do that. So actually, this wouldn't affect, that's the kind of crazy thing. This wouldn't affect trans-identified males very much at all, because they can just go swim when everyone else swims.
I am very conscious of my body, and I think everybody is, and I think that those paranoias are something that these people can tap into, because we all know what it feels like to feel self-conscious and a bit icky about your body. And
so I don't know what you mean by so obviously the paranoia, I guess, that any would be, and I guess paranoia isn't really, because paranoia is something irrational, but women's perspective, not wanting to be seen around men, or not wanting to have to be vulnerable in terms of, being in a relative state of undress. I think that's the main concern a lot of women have.
People should not be making people uncomfortable. That should be your first starting point,
Yeah, okay, so if you start with the starting point that people should not be making people uncomfortable, you realize that completely destroys the like trans inclusive argument, because a lot of women would be uncomfortable getting undressed around any man, but if anything, especially a man who is dressing up like a woman, because I think a lot of women recognize that, like, we know for a fact, I've said this before, we know for a fact AGP is a thing. The basic argument for AGP is that you can go to 4chan right now if you want to, and I'm guaranteed if you check a few of the boards, I mean, specifically go to like the LGBT board, which I don't really go to, but you will find posts about fetishizing feminization, like forced feminization or voluntary feminization, whatever the context is, you will find something about men fetishizing the idea of being treated as or made to look like women. And this is what I've always said, if you acknowledge that that is a thing, it is absolutely absurd to suggest that not one of those men who clearly fetishizes the idea of being perceived to be or becoming a woman has actually taken advantage of the opportunity that contemporary trans ideology affords for any man to claim they are a woman. So based on just those two things alone, it would make sense to say that autogynephilia is going to be a significant contributor to why somebody would identify as trans. So when you realize that, of course, it's ridiculous to suggest that concerns about people's comfort with their own body should motivate us to allow fetishistic biological males to exist in spaces that exist specifically for women.
And to hear somebody standing on a chair and calling somebody like me a pervert, they're not, and they can't expect any kind of,
Okay, so that's basically an interesting point. Pretty much the argument there is, I just realized I had a different window open from what I usually do. Basically, the argument there being that the gender critical movement loses credibility when they try to frame trans-identified males as a rule as being perverted. And I honestly would tend to agree with that. I think stressing the idea that trans-identified males are a threat and universally have ulterior, sinister motives is, one, inaccurate, but two, not very good optics. What I would prefer to do, and this is what I tend to do, is mostly stress the fact that their claim to being a woman, which is an objective claim they're seeking to make about reality, does not make sense. And if anything, I kind of would mention the autogynephilia concern as a kind of cherry on top. I think it's something that is worth mentioning, and in general, kind of women's concerns are worth mentioning. But you don't want to be going out saying, well, the main focus needs to be that obviously these people are a terrifying threat that make women feel unsafe. Because at that point, you run the risk that, again, ignoring the fact that I don't think that's entirely accurate, you run the risk that some women, a lot of women maybe, are going to think, oh, well, I know a trans-identified male and, they seem perfectly nice to me. And at that point, you're kind of making them think that what you're saying doesn't cohere with reality. Whereas the flip side is, if you say, well, trans-identified males, the main concern is just that they're making an inaccurate claim about reality, but we also should be mindful that some of them might have ulterior, sinister motives. And at that point, the person who maybe has a trans-identified male they know who they're actually quite friendly with, well, you're not saying anything that should contradict what they believe, because you're saying, like the fact that there's one trans-identified male who's quite nice, well, that's perfectly consistent with saying some of them might have sinister motives. Whereas the flip side is, all of the women who maybe have had bad experiences, they're thinking, they're feeling seen and spoke to by that. So it's basically just the more accurate and more optically beneficial way of talking about it. And certainly, I'm not someone who's going to tone police and say, and I've probably not included that many clips of this woman who's talking in the video, but basically she's kind of stood on a chair, maybe you've seen it, shouting, saying, this is bad, blah, blah, blah. And again, I don't mean blah, blah, blah to be dismissive, but, she's saying all sorts. But she's sounding quite aggressive. And obviously, I'm not going to say, therefore she's wrong or that's illegitimate, because I think that is a bad precedent to set when a lot of the time people who are systemically disadvantaged are likely to be angry in this way. And I think it's a very kind of, to be fair, this Freda media person has not done this, so I'll give credit there. But if one were to say, well, the fact this person's acting all angry and crazy, kind of crazy, which is I think how some people might perceive it, means that they are wrong. Well, if you apply that logic, then you could dismiss any marginalized group, because any group that faces like serious systemic oppression at some point, there are trans activists who have like gone crazy and like shouted at people and, really kind of caused a scene. And I think in that context, it's illegitimate to say, because this person's causing a scene, because this person's acting kind of, unhinged, that means they're wrong. Because there will be people who, maybe they're just having a bad day, like for either personal emotional reasons or sincere, genuine political reasons. There will be people who have legitimate points to make, but they behave in a way that makes them seem irrational and unhinged. So I think it's generally bad to say this person's behaving this way. Having said that, obviously the way this person's behaving is not the best optics. If I wanted to say, hey, let me show you something that will convince you that the gender critical movement is legitimate and all the goals are 100% valid and, above board, I would not point to this image or this video here.
There's no trans people in that debate. The debate is with people like Venice Allen and the people she surrounds herself with, and society. That's where the debate is. Society has done the risk assessment, right?
That's like a vaguely interesting point, but I don't really think it is that important. The debate is worth noting is not so much between trans-identified individuals and gender-critical people, because both those people are actually relatively small. The debate is mostly about the large number of people who, let's be honest, this person's saying, oh, they've done the risk assessment, blah, blah, blah. No, what's actually happened is that most of them have not thought about it. Like your average trans-affirming person on the street is just going to say, well, I support lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, and I guess the trans thing's just an extension of that, and, people should be free to do whatever they want, and blah, blah, blah. But, I don't think any of them could give an argument against the basic points that someone like me would make, or, any gender-critical person. They don't actually have an argument. They just would say, well, I don't really care about it, and they might say, well, it sounds bigoted. It has it's vibes-based, right? Because that's the crazy thing. Nothing I say is bigoted. I just disagree with a claim that's being made about reality. But a lot of progressive people would say, well, it sounds bigoted, and that means it's wrong. I do agree that the debate isn't really between trans-identified individuals and gender-critical people so much as it's well, I suppose that's the issue, isn't it? Because I'm catching myself here. Intellectually, I think that is the debate, because that's often the case, right? The debate around, religion, for example, is mostly a debate between, a small, tiny number of Christian apologists and a small, tiny number of atheist academics, or just religious apologists in general. So I don't know, that is the debate. And I think in the same way, the debate around trans identity is between gender critical people and trans ideologues, a lot of whom are trans. Not all of them, but a lot of whom. So while, yes, wider society is not predominantly made up of trans-identified individuals, there's lots of debates where, even though it has effects and implications for wider society, it's inaccurate to describe the debate as including wider society. And here, I don't think this is a debate that includes wider society at all.
We know that men commit more crimes and more sex, but they don't do it because they're men. They do it because of this misogyny in society. And when you say they do it because they're men, that gives men a free pass. It gives people like Andrew Tate this mentality that this is what men are.
Okay, so there's two issues there. One, even if it were true that men have a specific proclivity to do this kind of violence that is natural and innate, that still wouldn't mean that you don't have a choice. I saw an article recently that said, like, living in the north of England increases your chances of dying from drug abuse, alcoholism, or suicide. And I thought that was a really good way of encapsulating the kind of paradox of how, yes, there are systemic issues, but ultimately it's your choice, right? Like suicide being the obvious example. Yes, I can believe that people in the north of England, for a variety of reasons, might be more likely to commit suicide. But at the same time, it's not as if, like, saying living in the north of England increases your chances of dying by suicide sounds absurd, when at the end of the day, the main thing that's going to increase your chance of dying by suicide is, do you personally make the choice to take your own life? Right? Obviously. The same for alcoholism and drug abuse. Living in the north of England, does it increase your chance of drug abuse and alcoholism? Maybe, but you know what else? You know what the big thing is that increases your chances? Do you choose to abuse drugs? Do you choose to drink alcohol? If you don't choose to do either of those things, it doesn't matter where you live, you're not going to. So it's that kind of, and I think it applies to male violence as well, where it's like, you could say being a biological male increases your chance of committing violent crime. But at the same time, every biological male has the choice and has the ability to not do those things. So I think that's worth stressing. But the other thing is, even if it was about socialization, well, then my question would become, how are you defining trans identity such that you can say that trans-identified males don't experience that socialization? Because it would seem to me that you'd have to have a pretty clear definition in order to say, and therefore all these concerns about male socialization don't apply. Because the issue is that trans is such a nebulous concept, so broad, that it can include, again, like basically somebody who completely is typically masculine in every single way, but just says they're a woman, and that makes their trans identity valid. So how can you argue that person does not experience male socialization? You can't.
And we need to defend that misogyny, that really weird entitlement that men have. We need to defend it because it is innate, and it isn't. Just like me perhaps being trans isn't rooted in any kind of biology, them being...
There's kind of, the other thing there is this interesting idea that something being innate means it's okay. This is a mistake people make. And it's of course a problem because the obvious example would be, I think there's some argument to be made that paedophilia, or the proclivity towards paedophilia, is innate. That doesn't make it legitimate. That doesn't mean we should validate it. There are many things which might be innate, but that doesn't make them okay. You look at, innate, it's basically another way of saying natural. Well, there's lots of things that naturally occur in the animal kingdom that are absolutely horrible and evil. And of course, the flip side is there are many things which aren't innate, which are fine. Watching the TV isn't innate, but I think most people would say that watching the TV, at least in moderation, is completely fine. So
when they turn around and throw statistics at you that say things like, well, most sex crimes are perpetrated by men, well, there's a very specific fucking reason for that. And you're not looking at it. You're just pretending that by pointing at trans women...
Okay, look, why exactly misogyny exists and manifests in the ways it does is a very different discussion from the question of whether or not trans identity, it's related. But first of all, trans identity, again, even if you ignore all the social things, there's a question of, is it an accurate claim about reality? But if you're talking about the social things, there's basically a question of, how does this idea of trans identity interface with the reality of men and women existing and the sociological implications of men and women existing? You're still quite a far way away from the separate question of why exactly do males and females behave the way that they do typically in society. And that is a different discussion that is sufficiently different such that somebody can be gender critical and they can independently put a massive focus on that. They can put no focus on it at all. And they can have, you can have different gender critical people who might have wildly different opinions on that issue. You might have some gender critical people who, think that it's all kind of sociological. You might have some gender critical people who think that it's all completely innate, blah, blah, blah. Like there are many different opinions someone can have. So saying you're missing that issue, it's like saying that, if you're focused on economic policy, you're missing the important question of why it is that, the Iraq war happened. And it's like, well, no, that's a separate issue. It's not something that's being missed. Somebody might have opinions about that in addition to their opinions on economic policy. Like, it's just a different question. Related, sure, but different.
Hyper-focusing on trans women, that you've got some kind of solution to misogyny. Well, you haven't. You've actually created more of it.
Yeah, okay, so that's fair. Somebody who thinks that the gender critical issue is going to solve even a significant amount of the problems around gender, I think that person is kind of misguided. What I would say is that the gender critical position gives us a foundation to tackle the issues relating to gender, because the gender critical position is the only position that allows us to actually talk meaningfully about what a man and a woman is, and we need to be able to do that before we can tackle the issue. So essentially for me, the gender critical position, it doesn't solve actually that many problems at all, but it's an important first step to solving a lot of problems relating to gender in the categories of man and woman. My battery's running low. I'm going to have to switch it out. So 1 second.
That I adapt myself to be the person I want to be. And it's like, that's freedom of expression. So talking about wigs and stuff, it's just like, that's misogyny 101 for a start, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. So the point is, like, gender expression. The issue is, it's you don't know what you're talking about, because gender expression, that's a completely separate issue. And no one has a problem with somebody having gender expression. If somebody wants, if a biological female wants to cut her hair short and not wear makeup and, wear t-shirts and jeans, first of all, that's actually quite normal, but that's a kind of more masculine expression. She'd still be welcome to go to a women's only class. Gender expression isn't the issue. In fact, if gender expression was the issue, then I guess everyone would be fine with you going to the women's class because you express in a more feminine way, but they don't, because gender expression isn't the issue.
The Kenwood Ladies Pond is a historic, iconic, beautiful place that I've been going to since my early 20s.
I don't know how history or something beautiful or something being iconic has got to do with your need. Are you saying that...
Okay, so the reason why I'm just going to interrupt here is because the fact that this term, because apparently what's specifically called the women's pond, well, that means that there is a history, a substance to the fact that it was associated with women. So that speaks to how significant it is when you then completely detach it from the label woman by making the term woman not mean anything. That's the issue. Like when I talk about how the term feminism has lots of history and significance, the point there is that's why completely redefining the referent for what it means to be a feminist, which is to say woman, creates an issue.
This kind of cut all your bits off and you're a more trans woman is awful. It's a really horrible narrative.
It's just like, but like, that's the problem. How can you be so resistant to the idea that the term you're claiming to hold to should have more meaning? Like, to me, it's, I don't believe in the whole true trans thing, but it's pretty obvious that somebody who is like, let's say, a kind of effeminated, castrated gay man who would then, so basically what they call a HSTS or homosexual transsexual, is trans in certainly a different, and I would argue a more substantial sense than somebody whose claim to being trans is just that they wear a wig and, makeup, but or maybe don't even do that. Like, clearly. But that's the problem. These people, they claim to care a lot about this trans thing, but then they don't even care about whether or not the term trans means anything.
It plays into the idea that, we are complete if we do something. Like there's some kind of endpoint to transition. Like you embark.
Again, it's not about being complete. It's about like words having definitions. Like there are things about me that can't be true. It's like if I said I want to be a doctor, or I say I'm a doctor. The fact that I would need to get a PhD in order for that to be true, it doesn't mean I'm like not complete. It just means there's a thing about me I'm claiming that just isn't true.
On a medical journey where there's
medical journey. So yeah, being a doctor
rejects it anyway, because even if you could edit your chromosome, Venice wouldn't understand that. She wouldn't accept it because she has an idea of what trans women are, and it's probably
so trans women are definitionally biologically male, and that is the. So I do think from a sociological perspective, I did see a tweet that was like from a, I guess, kind of true trans person, and they were making fun of kind of gender critical. So saying, rad femmes have finally worked out the biggest threat to women of all, castrated gay men. And when you put it like that, it's kind of a quite funny way of making a kind of legitimate point. Obviously, yeah, sociologically, I would be quite comfortable saying that castrated gay men aren't really massive threats to women. Sorry if that kind of bothers some people, but I don't think that's true. But of course, there's still once you ignore all the questions of like sociological harm, the question of using words that make sense. And within that context, well, if you say a castrated gay man is a woman, what are you saying about women? I saw a tweet from a kind of HSTS person. They were like, if you're a twink and you're a bottom, you're basically a woman already. So why wouldn't you just transition? And it's like, is that what being a woman means to you? Well, I mean, that's what they're saying, right? So that's the problem. It's different kinds of offensive, right? There's the offensiveness of, like, if I said, oh, I feel like a woman, therefore I'm a woman, and that's offensive because it's completely denying any substance of what being a woman means, and it would be presenting a genuine threat to women if I were able to enter women's spaces. But then there's, the HSTS thing, where it's not a threat in the same sense, or it's not as an insult in the same sense, because at least you can say, well, there's substance to what they mean in identifying as trans and identifying as a trans woman. And you can kind of understand the logic of it, but the problem is the logic is incredibly misogynistic and a very kind of debasing and simplistic notion of what it means to be a woman.
What Venice is interested in, she's interested in trans exclusion, and that's why they get themselves wrapped up in these illogical arguments.
Violence and sexual violence.
I don't know what arguments have been illogical, but there was quite a substantial period of time basically just, again, stressing that idea of, if you care about, the gender critical position, I don't like the way the light's coming in, but whatever, it's fine, who cares? Then that's a problem, because that means you're not focusing on, these other systemic issues that matter. And it's like, well, who says that? For me, I mean, I've said before, for me, the gender critical issue, it's not my most important issue. It's the issue I talk most about because I don't think other people are addressing it. But like broadly, I care more about kind of, well, the broad strokes of socioeconomics. I don't think that this whole trans issue is going to solve all of our problems. Far from it. If someone were to tell me, you don't care about these other really important issues, I would say, well, no, you're wrong. In fact, I care about those other important issues more than I care about the gender critical issue. It just so happens I'm talking about this because, I think I pointed this out before, not everyone can always just be talking about the single most important issue. That would be like unrealistic, and it would make the world really boring if the only thing you're ever allowed to talk about was the most important thing.
Stay out of women's spaces. What they mean literally is stay out of my head, because they don't want to think about it. But also, conversely, they're obsessed with it. They catastrophize, and they will search for things online to justify their prejudice. They'll find.
I don't know about that. Stay out of my head. no, I mean, to be honest, like, I'm fine with trans-identified individuals occupying space in my head. And I think a lot of women would probably say they'd rather trans-identified people only occupied space in their head instead of occupied space in, you know, their prison cell or their changing rooms. Like, it seems a bit weird to say, like, and, you know, it's again, telling women what they really mean. It's not a good look. But I'm sure most women would tell you, know, when they say stay out of our spaces, they 100% mean stay out of our spaces. Now, as for whether or not, you know, there is a desire for trans-identified individuals to not exist in women's heads, I don't know about that. I mean, me personally, one thing that, you know, I don't want to allow to be lost sight of is that I actually find the whole trans debate, the gender identity debate, quite interesting. I'm quite happy to have this debate. In a way, I find it unfortunate the debate needs to happen, because I do think there are harmful effects of the, you know, ongoing nature of the debate, and insofar as my side is not fully, you know, winning. But I actually find it quite interesting. Like, I genuinely like talking about this topic. So at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy for the issue to be in my head, because it means I get to talk about some interesting questions, you know, about ontology and meaning, you know, phenomenology, all that kind of stuff.
And then just says absolutely, like, he opens his mouth and words come out, but none of them mean anything.
Do we really want to be making fun of people for saying words that don't...
They talk about this a lot. Has the tide changed? Has the tide turned? Well, judging by the state of the gender critical discourse this week, I'd say the tide has well and truly gone out and left a load of shit on the beach.
That's a funny line. Yeah, I actually find this whole, like, you know, who's winning, who's not winning, blah, blah, blah. It's an interesting question. I've been thinking about making a video for a while about kind of the right side of history and, you know, how are things actually going to play out and the implications of how things might play out. Because I think it's an interesting topic. I'm not going to discuss it now, but there we go. That's a little spoiler. You get, you know, if you go on Patreon, you get a little window behind the creative process or whatever, window into the creative process, a peek behind. There we go.
Funny that, because Julia doesn't like a lot of standing on a stool and shouting, because when climate activists stand on stools and shout, she's the first to call them ridiculous and, you know, basically... So
yeah, you know, that's my issue, right? There we go. That's kind of what I already said. It's a dangerous game to kind of get into this habit of being like judging people based on the way they communicate things. It's like, sure, maybe climate activists can sometimes seem a bit crazy, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. So I'm consistent. For me, I would say, regardless of what your opinion is, I'm not going to be like, oh, the way you're expressing it makes you stupid. Whereas I do suspect that this is a correct assessment, that based on what I know of Julie Hartley Brewer, I imagine she very much is the kind of person who would, you know, judge people who have genuinely correct causes and say, oh no, they're wrong because of the way they're behaving, because of the way they're expressing themselves and the nature of the activism they're engaging in. And that would make Julie Hartley Brewer a hypocrite in that regard. All right, I think that's enough of that. I don't know what exactly the sun's doing. I feel like slowly it's been creeping up. So I guess we should end this now before I end up completely, you know, washed out by the sun. I'm wearing my nice white. This is actually grey. It's just because the sun. That's not true. It's white. It's not just because of the brightness of the sun. Anyway, yeah, that's the end of that video, kind of. I sort of ended it a bit early because I felt like I've been recording for long enough, and basically the video just pivoted to being about like the comments and the reactions to the story, and I'm like, well, look, I'm already reacting to someone reacting to a video. I don't want to react to someone reacting to the reaction to a video, because that's a bit too much. So there we go. But I hope this video wasn't too much. I hope it was just right, and you know, I look forward to, you know, returning to this format again next week. And again, let me know your recommendations and I'll be sure to check them out. That's that. That's the end of the video. It's crazy because I don't need to say like, oh, you know, please like and subscribe and give on Patreon, because I don't, because you've already given on Patreon. That's why you're here. So